My guest today is James Unkles. James is a lawyer by occupation. He spent 28 years in the Australian Navy specialising in criminal law with extensive experience as an advocate before military court-martials and in civil courts as a police and Crown prosecutor. He's got a reputation for addressing injustices, and he's got himself over the last number of years involved in the Brake and Morant case. Now, the only thing I know, James, of the Brake and Morant case is what I saw in a movie many, many years ago, probably 40 years ago. Beyond that, I didn't know much at all about Brake and Morant until I started doing a little bit more research in preparation for this interview. But let's drill down, if we can, on who is Brake and Morant.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. It's a pleasure to be interviewed about this important aspect of Australian military law and history, a matter that's that simply won't go away, at least since I took the case on 10 years ago. Brake and Morant, some would say, is an enigma. A colourful past in England before he came to Australia. He was born in England. All sorts of dramas associated with his growing up. But eventually, to cut to the chase, he came to Australia in the 1860s looking for adventure. The reality is, I think he was trying to escape debts back in England. Had a reputation as a womanizer, but a gent, well educated, went to the Navy College in Britain, but fled England and as a refugee, I suppose you'd say, made a great life for himself in Australia, an expert horseman, robust, living on the land, but also very well educated, has a great repertoire of poetry that he's written and published, did a lot of writing for the Bulletin magazine, worked on cattle stations, particularly up in Queensland, and then found his way down to Adelaide and South Australia, spent a lot of time in Renmark, and again, I suppose looking for some adventure, perhaps also trying to escape some more debts, decided to enlist to go to the Boer War. And he, because of his skills in riding and shooting and so forth, joined up a contingent, South Australian contingent, the South Australian Rifles, and left for South Africa for some adventure, and adventure he got. He did his service and promoted. He then went back to England for a break, and then he went back to South Africa directly from England and signed a contract for 12 months to serve in a British contingent, the Bushveld Carbineers. Now, Lord Kitchener, a very clever and devious military commander who probably showed a lot of attributes you would expect from, say, fighting in the Middle East or in Afghanistan. He was given the task of beating the Boers, bring them to their knees, and Kitchener decided that Australian soldiers were ideally suited. So the Bushveld Carbineers was created as a contingent, and Lieutenant Morant accepted a commission as a lieutenant. His two partners, Lieutenant Peter Hancock and Lieutenant George Witton, also signed up with the Bushveld Carbineers. So they sign up in early 1901, mid-1901,
yes,
with the Bushveld Carbineers. And of course, later in that year, they carry out orders from British Command.
Okay. Let's pause it there, because that's the next chapter.
Sure.
So they're in South Africa fighting against the Boers, who were, for my memory of modern military history, they were Dutch fighters, and it was the Dutch and the English, and this was a war in which many lives were lost, more lives than any we'd seen in modern military history. And so Morant and his associates have linked up with this mercenary group and their job was to mop up after the major Boer Wars had been conducted. Yeah?
The British found that the beating the Boers was next to impossible. It's like trying to beat the Taliban. It wasn't going to happen. And there were peace negotiations going on with the Boer command to try and settle the fight. But in the meantime, Kitchener deployed the Bushveld Carbineers, including with British officers in the Bushveld Carbineers, to live off the land and go after the Boers. People have to remember that the Boers by day were farmers. By night, they were fighters and killers. They weren't bound by any rules of engagement other than to fight and kill. They lived off the land. They got support from their families and from their farms. So Lord Kitchener decided to invoke draconian measures, including concentration camps to put the families into those camps, erect blockhouses and kilometres of barbed wire to try and contain the Boers. But a Boer fighter during the day, unlike the British, didn't wear a uniform. They were farmers. They were living off the land. Even the young boys acted as spies for the Boers. So the Bushveld Carbineers were supposed to live off the land like the Boers and beat them. Yep. And that was their primary purpose, to mop up. But mopping up, there's a lot to mopping up. Mopping up was a tough call for the BVC.
Are they equivalent at all to what we would think of as the SAS? Are they that sort of crack, elite, rough and tough kind of group?
Rough and tough. In fact, even Lord Kitchener arranged to have some Aboriginal trackers come out from Australia to track and assist. I've made a lot of comparisons between the way the war was fought against the Boers with the way we try to fight wars in the Middle East and Afghanistan. You could pass a Boer farmer during the day and just assume that at night he was going to be blowing up railway lines and sniping at British soldiers. And that's the sort of war it was. And at one point, the British had over 300,000 troops in South Africa, and they still couldn't win. But getting back to these three men, like their comrades, they were three commissioned officers, and they were doing their job as they were told to do.
And they, in the execution of their duty, pardon the pun, they killed a number of Boer.
Yep. Yeah, about 12 in all. Critics say that they killed a lot more, but there's never ever been any satisfactory evidence produced. But early in their service, they weren't killing people. They were out fighting, but not summarily executing. There was a phase of the war that turned the tide against Morant. It was a phase of the war where his British superiors, and I've named a couple of them in my research, Lord Kitchener was becoming concerned about Boers looting British supplies and uniforms, supplies as they became desperate to sustain themselves, but also British uniforms to keep warm out on the veldt. But Kitchener did issue an order in October 1901 saying the use of British uniforms was to be met with summary execution. The other trigger for Morant was his British superior, Captain Percy Hunt. He and Morant were very good mates. They travelled to England together. They were very good mates. And Hunt also relayed orders that in some circumstances, summary execution was to be used as a form of reprisal. So Boers were summarily executing British soldiers and also black people that were supporting the British. And the orders were, well, in some circumstances, you carry out summary execution, including Boers looting and wearing British uniforms. So at one point, tragically, Captain Hunt was killed in a fight, but there's evidence that he was taken alive and tortured and killed by the Boers. It was at that point that Morant said, okay, the gloves are off, Reprisal is the name of the game, and reprisal was recognised under British military law at the time. And because of the treatment of Captain Hunt, Morant then took charge and said, I will now carry out the orders that have been given to me. And at the time, those orders were to seek reprisal, and that's what he did.
So this isn't a case of Morant and his friends going rogue.
Well, that's what critics say. They went rogue, but all they were doing was what other British soldiers were doing. I've uncovered evidence in the House of Commons debates at the time that there were British soldiers writing home to their families saying that they were executing prisoners. So Morant, the only soldiers that were really caught and tried, and two of them eventually executed, was Morant, Hancock and Witton, Australian soldiers. Lord Kitchener needed some heads to roll. And so the prosecutions proceeded against these three Australians.
So you're not denying that they killed these prisoners?
No.
You're not seeking to clear them of their guilt. What is it, in fact, that you're seeking to do and have invested the last 10 years in trying to do on behalf of the families of these men?
Well, that's a fair question. It's been a question that I've been asked many times. Rather than just read all my material on my website, breakermorant.com and so forth, and my published materials, some of the strongest evidence about these shootings comes from George Witton, Lieutenant Witton, who was sentenced to life imprisonment but released, and he came back to Australia and wrote his book Scapegoats of the Empire. And he was a living witness to how this trial was constructed and how the sentences were carried out. And he talks about the gross injustice that these men believed surrounding, that these men believed they were carrying out lawful orders. And yes, they did admit to the shootings, but you've got to remember you're dealing with three Australian country lads, unskilled, not professional soldiers, and not skilled in the art of military law. They believed that they had to carry out those orders. Willful disobedience of an order in that time was a capital offence. So George Witton's insight into how they were treated is very, very compelling. And when he came, while he was in prison in Britain, Sir Isaac Isaacs, who later became Australia's Governor-General and Chief Justice of the High Court, he advocated for Witton and wrote a scathing legal opinion that these men should not have been, certainly not executed. Tried, probably, but not executed. And in my work, I have taken the work of people like Isaacs, George Witton's concerns. I've built a very strong case, not guesswork, like some other authors that I know, not presumptions. All of my assertions and materials are backed up by evidence, including evidence to take no prisoners. So I actually believe that the fair and just thing that what I'm pushing for is for the Australian government to do what the New Zealand government did when it was examining the treatment of 5 New Zealand soldiers executed by the British in World War I. In 2002, that inquiry led to compassionate posthumous pardons for those 5 New Zealand soldiers, and in particular their descendants. I'm asking for the same thing on behalf of the descendants of Morant, Hancock and Witton. That what's the government got to fear? A short independent inquiry by a retired judge able to vet and review the evidence for and against, the evidence that I've accumulated, listen to the critics that say otherwise, and come up with a report for the government to go into the Parliament. In 2018, a motion was put into the House of Representatives by Scott Bulchott's MP in Queensland. It's a very compelling read. The motion acknowledges that these men were not tried according to law. Due process was not followed. It was polluted. and they suffered a terrible injustice. In other words, they were not tried according to British law at the time, and the sentences were illegal, inappropriate. And the motion extended an apology to the descendants of these men and clearly stated that the trial process was unfair. Now, I've built on that motion to lobby this current government and predecessors to do that inquiry. I can't see from the descendants' perspective why that's such a problem. If doubt remains, what's the fear? I suspect the fear is, this is held by my critics, and I say some of the critics are included at the Australian War Memorial, and some RSLs, is that the truth may be revealed. And I've had a lot of support from MPs, ministers, very senior legal counsel, including Geoffrey Robertson QC, international jurist.
They were treated monstrously. The case of Morant and Hancock, the two men who were executed, is a disgrace.
I agree with the general tenor of everything that Geoffrey Robertson said. I'm a great admirer of Geoffrey Robertson. We need more Geoffrey Robertsons in the system. But it was a gross injustice too.
Look, in my opinion, this case is controversial for a number of reasons. Firstly, of course, it was the British exercising jurisdiction or criminal jurisdiction over Australians. That is the background, I suppose. But the second reason it's controversial is that I think there are unquestionably fundamental flaws in the legal process that resulted in these convictions.
Yeah, well, Jim, I think this speaks to the Aussie notion of a fair go, and I think there's been an injustice here, and it's obvious to Australians that this has never been resolved.
So you're after an independent assessment of the case.
Yes.
Ideally, you'd like to see a posthumous pardon, and that would help the families to reconcile the nature of the facts and the history as you understand it and they understand it. What is it about the trial? Can we talk about that a little bit more? What is it about the trial that you say is a sham?
Well, it was a sham. Well, what I'm about to tell you are the sort of issues that were looked at in the Supreme Court hearing in 2013. Let's start with the arrest. The prejudice to these men was created from the time they were arrested. They were held in solitary confinement, arrested in about October 1901. The prosecution had unlimited resources to start preparing their case. These three men were kept in solitary confinement. They were denied any access to a lawyer, which they had a right to. Mm-hmm. They were denied any access to the Australian government. Remember, Australia was a country, a part of the empire in 1901. We became federated. Mm. So they were denied the contact with their own government. They were also denied compassionate contact with their descendants. One has to ask why. What's going on for Lord Kitchener that he doesn't allow this? So time rolled on. They then went to a court of inquiry in November 1901. That court of inquiry looked at some of the evidence. The judge advocate, whose job was to review every trial, every military investigation, James St. Clair, Colonel St. Clair, I have his notes from his review, and he clearly says that there was evidence of orders to take no prisoners that had to be obeyed. Mm. The inquiry is in camera. No word of it got out to the media. They then spend all of Christmas, New Year, and then on about the 13th of January, Major Thomas, James Thomas, an infantry officer, but also a lawyer from Tenterfield, is summoned to Pretoria with 1 day's notice, told your defence counsel. Major Thomas was a small town country solicitor that did conveyancing and probate. He was not a polished military lawyer. In fact, he was in the war as an infantry officer, not as a lawyer. He took the case on because there was no other alternative offered. He was denied access to the telegraph to contact Australia. He was denied support to commensurate to what the prosecution had. He was given 1 day. Now, I don't know, your listeners would ask themselves the question, if you were arrested by the police and you're told you've got 1 day to prepare a defence, how would you feel?
They were rightly put on trial, but they were wrongly tried. And the defences that could have been run, which would have led to a much lighter sentence, in fact, it would have ensured that they did not face execution, were simply not heard.
Major Thomas, in his writings, talks about the appalling situation where he wants to use the telegraph to petition the king. Petition of mercy. Now, petitions of mercy at the time were lawful. They were used frequently. This isn't something that we've dreamed up in the modern era. This existed at the time.
So they found them guilty, sentenced them to death one evening, 6 a.m. the next morning, a dawn execution. No opportunity to contact their families. The Australian government outrageously was not informed. These were a couple of colonials whom the British establishment decided to sacrifice to cover up the fact that the take no prisoners policy was indeed in force and had been approved, or at least acquiesced in, by higher-ups.
The Prime Minister and the Australian Parliament didn't find out until April 1902, when reports from the British media, the Times, alerted to their predicament, to this trial. And the Prime Minister was appalled, absolutely appalled, and he was questioned about it in Parliament. So again, it's about not only lawful due process being abused, but the lack of the right of appeal goes to the very heart of our legal system to this day.
So we're not talking about matters of law that apply now but didn't apply then.
No. I've had critics say to me, "Oh, you're judging it by 2020." Well, that's rubbish. I'm not. My research is impeccable. I take me too long to go into the detail, but it's been the best thing I ever did, Ian, to satisfy my critics. I put all my material out to experts, those far more expert than me, former judges, including a former Chief Justice of New South Wales, Judge Street.
British justice should be justice the same for everybody. Sir Douglas Menzies once said, justice is justice according to law. And this was an exercise of the administration of criminal justice, which sadly miscarried.
I've said to my critics, how could it be that I compile opinions from all these people and that somehow you accuse me of cooking the books? I mean, it's ridiculous.
Perhaps it's because in this current context in which we've fought this horrible war in Afghanistan for the last 20 years, America has just withdrawn, Australia has pulled out, and the Taliban, who were supposed to be fighting, are now back in power. The SAS, somehow in there, the chain of command went awry. We have senior people who've been accused of heinous crimes. Maybe there's just not a lot of appetite at the moment for people who are perceived to be war criminals.
My appetite is for upholding the rule of law. And if you're a criminal and you've been justly tried and convicted, then you deserve to be sentenced. I've been a lawyer all my life. I've worked as a prosecutor. I know the ins and outs of the legal systems. I'm a great advocate for lawful due process. But all of this can be fixed quite clearly. And I can say this as part of this interview. The descendants who I represent, there's about 30 of them from the three families, will unequivocally accept the outcome of an independent inquiry, whether it's for or against. And I might add, I will as well.
because two great wrongs were done to both Breaker Morant and Peter Hancock, absolute wrongs, and also a wrong to George Witton. And this goes to the moral values and fabric of a nation. We know these wrongs were done. Do we do nothing about it? Or do we in fact seek to at least, we can't reinstate life, correct the formal record by one method or another here or in Great Britain?
So I say to those that might be watching this podcast, have a think about it, read some of the material, send me an email through the website. Happy to look at all of that. But if you are moved by this case, write to the federal government, write to the Prime Minister like I have, put it to an inquiry.
Well, James, it's been fascinating talking with you, and I've learned a lot about Breaker Morant and friends today, and I will follow this with interest. And I guess if people get onto your website, breakermorant.com, and you'll continue to update there with any media releases, if in fact we end up having this independent assessment of the trial, that will be surely an interesting chapter in Australia's history to follow. And thank you for your dogged research and support of the families over these years. And I wish you well in your endeavours.
Final word, Ian. Thank you for those words, and I'll pass them on to the descendants. If an inquiry is engaged, I look forward to coming back and doing a follow-up interview with you. For those who might want to know a little bit about Major Thomas and the terrible suffering he endured when he came back to Australia, I've published a book about Major Thomas and Ready, Aim, Fire. If someone wants to read that, they can order it through Booktopia, or they can send me an email. I'll be happy to send it out to them. It's a great read, and it pays homage to a lawyer from small town Tenterfield at the time who endured enormous suffering and sacrifice to do the very thing that I'm trying to do at the moment, and that's uphold the respect for the rule of law.
Did he have any concept at all that 120 years later we'd still be talking about this? But he's got unfinished business, and it's amazing to think that this story is still going on. Thank you.
A lot of my work is to pay homage to the work. He couldn't quite get it over the line. He advocated to state premiers and so forth, and in the end it just drove him to his grave. So I'm trying to rectify that for him and his descendants.
Thank you so much for your time today, James. It's been
Thanks, Ian.
awesome talking with you. Thank you.
Cheers.